So I gather there's a lot of agreement about the importance of individuals being able to determine their own destiny, being able to do that with like-minded other individuals in the form of a community, communities being able to deliberate amongst each other to work out what they value, for that to change over time, for sub-communities to be created. What are the practical threats to that in South Africa at the moment? In some of the campaigns that you've been involved in, where do you feel that communities are under pressure, and where is it coming from?
Yes, I want to jump to a solution, but I'll keep that something. There's just an important aspect that I think we haven't touched on, which is the importance of institutions. But in terms of our experience in South Africa, because it's good to, and I'm happy you asked the question, because we need to talk about, okay, how do we make this practical? And I think part of the, from a community perspective, and you could say from an individualist perspective as well, I think part of the problem in South Africa is, let me start by saying this, that it's true, you can have, I think it's important to stress that you can have multiple identities and you can belong to multiple communities. And so you mentioned Afrikaans and the Afrikaners, so there's actually a difference between being part of the Afrikaans community as opposed to the Afrikaner community, just as an example. And that's not the same as the South African community, if such a thing exists. But that's the point I want to get to, is I think part of the problem, there are multiple reasons to the trouble we have in South Africa at least, but I think part of the problem with the current dispensation is that there was such a strong emphasis placed on being a South African that other community identities was regarded as a threat. And I know at AfriForum we've heard this a lot, by, in different spheres we've had people say, but okay, so you guys say you are Afrikaners, but that's the old way of thinking. You need to abandon that sense of identity and adopt the new identity, under the assumption or the claim that everyone in South Africa is the same and we think about things the same way, when in truth we don't. We have different cultures, and that doesn't mean necessarily the one is right and the one is wrong. So a practical example would be AfriForum has a good relation with traditional communities all over South Africa, and the most prominent or most famous or best known is the Zulu community and the Zulu King. So the Zulu community, at least under the King, they have a completely different view of property rights than we do. We believe in private property. They believe in communal ownership, and the King decides. But it's not for us to go to them and say, well, you guys are wrong, so you need to change your way of thinking. Because we also need, other than simply saying, and I think that's part of the threat that we currently have in modern society, not only in South Africa, is we tend to only think in terms of statist identity and in terms of economic benefit. So I think what's part of the problem, at least in South Africa, is to have just a healthy recognition for the fact that South Africa is, I wouldn't say it's a community, you can rather say it's a society that consists of different communities. And the way to deal with that is not to pretend that everyone is the same, or to pretend that to try to force everyone to be the same, but to say, listen, let's accept that we view things differently, and let's encourage mutual recognition and respect between different communities. That's at least one, I think, important part. Then, of course, there are other problems like, corruption and so forth. But I think this community aspect is and I've used the example before. It's just a famous quote that sort of illustrates this, is Samora Machel, who said, "For the nation to prosper, the tribe must die." So that's a way of replacing what you could describe as the natural community with an artificial community, and hoping that it will work, when I think South Africa has shown that it doesn't work.
So, Martin, you've talked about why it's important to limit power, that liberals accept the nature of human beings as having a potential for being greatly destructive. What are the institutional mechanisms that we ought to have in place to ensure that the ruthless, the bloodthirsty aren't able to enact their will on the rest of us?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the answer to that lies at the very core of what liberalism is as a political ideology. And it also kind of alludes to kind of where there's been an inadequate kind of thought attributed to it. So the kind of the historical or the standard answer is we have the separation of powers and we have checks and balances. This is a totally statist answer, but it is an important answer, and it's part of it. You have the state that is internally diffused, both vertically and horizontally. But then you have what I would say is perhaps the most important thing, and that is something that Ernst and the Solidarity Movement, why in a book that's coming out later this year, in which I contributed a chapter, I kind of write it specifically acknowledging the Solidarity Movement as practical liberalism. And that is the intermediate institutions that exist between the state and the individual. Now, liberals like Hayek acknowledged the importance of these institutions, but the emphasis has always been on the state. And that's kind of an issue that stopped with the American Revolution, I would almost say. It's where liberal constitutionalism started the conversation, and it ended almost immediately. And it stuck with the trias politica, the horizontal checks and balances and the vertical checks and balances. And that is the model that we've implemented across the world almost without exception. I would say that, and here Professor Kwes Malan has written quite a bit, and I take my cue from AfriForum as well, and that is that the power of communities in society must also increasingly be recognized to kind of self-regulate. And I mean, I know this is recorded, and that's very unfortunate, but the National Party had interesting ideas in 1992 when they proposed their kind of post-apartheid plan for South Africa, and it was a very federalist model that would effectively distribute power not only at the national level, the provincial and the regional and the local level, but they went all the way to the neighborhood level and said that certain powers must vest at the geographic neighborhood level. I would say that that's something that remains unexplored. And then the other thing as well, and again, Professor Malan has spoken quite a bit about this, and that is that, for instance, professions in society, the bar, you and I had a discussion about this the other day, these must become generally self-regulating, sovereign in their own domain. That is, if you're an advocate, you and your fellows must decide how the advocate's profession is governed, to an extent how the judge's profession is governed as well, given that interplay. And this must really apply across the board, because in so doing you have a far more significant diffusion of power, which is ultimately what liberal politics is supposed to be about. As Hayek and others have put it, liberalism is about the elimination as far as possible of coercion in society, and the only way to really make that a practical reality is not to just compartmentalize the state, because ultimately people are drawn to power. The worst among us will always want to then be in the state, whether in the judiciary, in the legislature, or in the executive, to exercise that power. You have to diffuse power in every domain, in every context. And yes, that might lead to inefficiencies. Of course, it may lead to inefficiencies. There is benefit to be gained in a unitary system. It's more efficient in many cases. But efficiency outside of the market is not the only thing you should be striving for. In politics, and this is, I would say, what liberalism offers, is in politics you want inefficiency. That is the whole point. You want the political system to be inefficient precisely because it is the greatest concentration of coercive power in society. So yeah, I've answered your question by saying that liberalism has proposed various things, but it's not gone quite far enough, and I'm not entirely sure why we started with the trias politica and we stopped with the trias politica. I'm still looking for the answer to that question. I just think that we need to look a little bit further afield, look at Taiwan with their 5 branches of government, look at Belgium with its recognition of community power, look at the tricameral parliament in South Africa a few years ago as well, as an example of dividing legislative power, not necessarily racially, but into more than just 2 chambers of a parliament. So I think there's a lot more to be done in diffusing power, and I think when you have that lodestar of the diffusion of coercive power in society, that kind of leads you down there.